I was coming back from the Denver airport last week when a bumper sticker on the back of the car that I was following caught my eye. It read, "Please be patient, student driver." Please be patient. Have you discovered that patience is not only something that we need when we follow a student driver on the highways, or whenever we're driving on the highways, but it's something we need in all of life? Have you discovered that? I'm sure that you have. I know that I have. Patience is one of those commodities that we all need and that we probably all feel like is in short supply in our lives. Well, please be patient is the theme of James's message here in James chapter 5, verses 7 through 11. That word patient is found 3 times in our paragraph, and the word endurance is found twice in this passage. And so James is trying to encourage his readers and us of the value of having patient endurance in life. Now, before we talk about the relevance of this particular text to our lives, why don't we talk about what this text meant to its original audience? Let's talk about what this text means in context, that is, in the verses that surround it. James is writing to readers who, they felt the oppression of the rich. Remember that? Chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. Their rich oppressors were withholding their daily wages. Some of the poor Christians were even being murdered by their rich oppressors. And I'm wondering if some of James's readers may have felt that God had forgotten them, that here was their situation, which was dire, and God was nowhere to be found. It may even be possible that James is writing to a group of zealots, Christians who have that particular political leaning. And these zealots were prepared to take matters into their own hands, to take up arms against those evil oppressors, and James wants them to not even think about that kind of action. Well, at least that's one perspective that a respected commentator has. At any rate, what we learn here is that James is trying to encourage his readers to be patient. And if you'll permit me to paraphrase, maybe he's saying something like this: I know that you are suffering. I know that you are wondering if God sees and if God cares and if God is going to do anything about your situation. Don't try to take matters into your own hands. Don't do anything foolish. I hear James saying, by no means should you abandon your faith in God. No, you want to remain loyal to God. He will come to your rescue in His own good time. He will right all wrongs, but on His timetable. He hasn't forgotten you. Just be patient and wait upon the Lord. Well, that's good advice for James's readers, and that's good advice for all of us, to be patient. Say, do you and I need to hear that message? Please be patient. Well, let me ask you a question or two. Are there any among you who are suffering? Are there any among you who are facing hardship and adversity? Are any of you under the cruel thumb of an oppressor? Are any of us in need of patience? Well, to ask those questions is likely to answer them, because at one point or another we all go through some kind of suffering, some kind of hardship, and we need patience to endure those situations. So, here's what I'm proposing. Let's look in this text for the encouragement that James might give us to be patient. What is there in this text that might encourage each of us to patiently endure no matter what kind of suffering or hardship we are now undergoing? First of all, let's talk about the example of the patient farmer. James talks about him. Imagine the patience of a farmer in ancient Israel, or even of a farmer today in our own land. He sows his seed, and he is depending on the early and the late rains to bring a harvest. Now, in ancient Israel, 3/4 of the rain fell in a short time period. Those farmers were so dependent on the early rains and the late rains. And these farmers are dependent on the seed and the rain and the soil for the seed to germinate and grow and produce a harvest. And what does the farmer do? He waits and waits and waits. And this period of waiting could easily include hard times, privations, and even hunger. But he waits. But he's trusting in the seed and in the soil and in the rain. He's trusting in the natural processes. More than this, he's trusting in the first cause behind these natural processes. I'm talking about God. He's got to have a lot of faith in God. He's trusting and he's patiently waiting. And James's point here is that eventually, the farmer is rewarded for his patience. And of course the application is that so will every Christian who waits patiently upon the Lord. So the example of the farmer might encourage us, but even more, the example of the prophets might encourage us. James tells us in verse 10 that they are the ones who speak in the name of the Lord. They speak in the name of the Lord. That's what a prophet does. And they were committed to that task no matter the situation, however malevolent they found themselves in. I'm thinking of Jeremiah, who was beaten and put in stocks, and on another occasion was thrown into a muddy well. And when you think about Jeremiah and how he suffered for a 40-year career, this preacher had few, if any, converts. The people of his day would not listen to him, but he continued to faithfully speak the word of the Lord. He continued to faithfully represent God. He remained true to God, even in spite of that suffering. What an example of patience. I think of another prophet, the one named Daniel. You remember, don't you, that Daniel rose to a prominent position in the government. And there were certain governmental officials who wanted to entrap him. Maybe they were jealous of his standing. And they rightly said to themselves, you know, if we're going to find anything, any ground for complaint against this Daniel, well, we're going to have to find it in connection with the law of his God, because he is blameless otherwise. And so they hatched this evil plan. They went to King Darius and said, why don't you make an ordinance that says, whoever prays to anyone else but you, O king, well, that person will be thrown into the lion's den. And you know the story. They knew that they could depend upon Daniel's spirituality. Sure enough, they caught him in the act of talking with his God, and they threw him into the lion's den. But you also know the story of how God rescued him from the mouth of the lion. James chapter 5 verse 11 summarizes what James says about the patience of the prophets. Indeed, we call blessed those who showed endurance. Daniel, Jeremiah, we could talk about Ezekiel, we could talk about Isaiah, we could talk about the minor prophets. They all have entered into a state of blessedness because they endured pain, privation, suffering, hardship, a state of blessedness. They've entered into the presence of God. And that's what I think James must be talking about here. He wants us to know that those who endure to the end, those who are faithful to God, those who are patient in suffering and hardship, they will one day be rewarded. In fact, that's what our Lord himself said. Remember Matthew chapter 5, verses 11 and 12. What beautiful words. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Jesus himself tells us that when we suffer patiently, when we endure hardship, we're not only in good company, the company of the prophets who even now are enjoying the presence of the Lord, but we are promised a reward, a great reward that is in heaven. If we endure suffering and adversity as the prophets did, we too will be rewarded. We too will be allowed to enter into the presence of God. And so that should encourage us too. The example of the prophets. But finally, James says, I want you to think about the example of Job. Now, we've all heard of the patience of Job, haven't we? What may be more well known to us is the suffering that he endured. Job, well, there is no greater example of suffering in all of the Bible. Job lost his health, he lost his wealth, and he lost his family. How he suffered. Actually, we may know more of his suffering than we do of his patience, because Job did not go quietly into the night as he suffered. He complained bitterly to God because of his dire circumstances. But that's not the point, is it? The point is not that Job complained or that Job talked to God and confronted God about his situation, that he even argued with God and tried to reason with God as he tried to understand why he was suffering so. The point of Job is that although he complained, he never lost his faith in God. He never renounced his faith. I like Job 13 and verse 15, where Job says, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Talk about a deep faith. Though he kill me, yet will I put my hope in him. And I like Job 19, verses 25 and 27. Listen to this confidence. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and that at the last he will stand upon the earth, and after my skin has been destroyed, then in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see on my side. Job had every confidence that at the end, in the end, God would vindicate him. God would be at his side. God would redeem him. Job was later vindicated, as you know from the story of Job. He came to a better understanding of the nature of God. God showed himself to him, and he was vindicated. He was rewarded, if you please, for his faith. But that's not the point of the story in James that I want us to think about. There's more to this story, according to James. For James writes that Job's story tells us something about the purpose of the Lord. The purpose of the Lord. The purpose of suffering. What is the purpose of suffering? According to James chapter 5 and verse 11, it is to reveal God's compassion and mercy. Now, you may ask, how is the Lord compassionate and merciful if He allows His children to suffer? And I would answer, He is loving and gracious in that He provides the strength that we need to endure suffering to the end. Doesn't this remind us of James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4? We're going back to that theme of suffering and trials. And what does James say in that passage? Count it all joy when you suffer various trials. Why, James? Because you understand it serves a purpose. What is that purpose? It is to grow your character. It is to cultivate your endurance, your ability to hang tough when the situation is hard. It grows your character. It leads to your spiritual maturity. That's one purpose of suffering. But now here in chapter 5, James tells us another purpose of suffering. He says that when we remain steadfast through hard times, this reveals God's strength. In particular, it reveals His faithful nature. It reveals His character. It's as if James has to remind us just here that life is not at all about us. It's about God. It's about God's glory. It's about showing people God's strength in times of weakness. Showing His glory, strength and weakness. Nothing demonstrates the glory and the strength of God like the ability of a person, due to supernatural strength, to remain faithful and patient in times of suffering and hardship. I'm thinking of a particular Christian woman who had a terrible disease, but she smiled through her disease, a disease that eventually took her life. She never denied the Lord. She never lost her faith. She never became disloyal to Him. And when people saw that although she was suffering, she had an inner strength, when they saw the hope that was in her heart, and they knew that these things could never have been originated, never have grown, never have come to full strength on her own power, they knew they had to give the credit to God. You see, in our weakness, God's strength is demonstrated. And so James says, when we endure hardship and when we patiently endure suffering, we are communicating to the people who are watching us that there's something different about us. We have a patience and endurance that cannot be explained outside of God's supernatural strength and power, and they would be caused then to glorify God. That's the purpose of suffering that James is talking about here. And he says Job is an example of that. Just as Job in his suffering came to understand the character of God, the faithfulness of God, the mercy of God, so we and the people around us come to understand those very same things about our God when we patiently endure suffering. So, we all suffer. We all face adversity and hardship. No one of us is immune to trouble. What might encourage us to face suffering with patience? The example of the farmer, the example of the prophets, the example of Job, the notion that those who endure to the end will be rewarded, the notion that when we patiently endure suffering, we show to others and to ourselves the compassion and the mercy of God. We must wait patiently as we suffer. We must endure hardship with patience. Well, when you think about it, what else can we do? There is nothing anyone can do to hasten the coming of Jesus. We must wait patiently and let God act according to His schedule, according to His timetable, and not ours. So we really don't have much choice, do we, but to wait patiently. But here's the good news, my friend. Jesus is coming back. And one day God is going to right all the wrongs of the world. And one day He is going to rescue His children one way or another. He's going to rescue them from suffering and from hardship. Our only task is to wait patiently for the Lord, to depend upon Him, to not lose our faith in Him, to know that in the end, He will not only vindicate us, but He will use our suffering to glorify His name. May God bless us as we patiently endure whatever suffering is on the horizon or whatever hardship we are now enduring. May God bless us to use that situation as a way to glorify Him.